So we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. So this is 4.7 part 2. So we're continuing with our piecewise functions. So for example 3, we have to write a piecewise function for the graph. So we're just going to treat each piece separate, just like we did yesterday. We're going to do one piece at a time. So we're going to start with the left side. So I'm starting with this graph. So to write an equation of a line, we can write it as y equals mx plus b. So what do I need to know if I write it in this form?
Slope.
I need to know the slope. And what else? The y-intercept. So our y-intercept is 3 because it crosses the y-axis at 3. So b would be 3. How can I find the slope? Rise over run. So we can count. Just pick any 2 points on the graph. See how much you go up and over. So I go up 1 to the right 1. So what's my slope? 1. So when we write this, we're going to write it just like we see in the other ones where it's y equals here. So I would have y equals, and then that little squiggly line. So I plug it into my equation here. So y equals x plus 3. Perfect, because this is my m and my b. So I'm writing it in the form of y equals mx plus b, but now my y equals is just outside of that squiggly line. And we just put that there because y is 2 parts. It's this equation and this one. So we write it just like it's written here. But we also have to include the restriction. So notice here it says if x is less than 0. So we need to include that part too. So we're talking about x values that are, it stops at 0 for our x values. We're talking about our x values. Are we talking about x values that are less than 0 or greater than 0 for this piece of the graph? Less than, because look at our graph. It starts here at 0, and then it goes -1. It goes -1, -2, -3. So we're talking about the values that are less than. So I would say x is less than 0. Do you think I should put less than or equal to? Why just less than?
Less than because the circle is open.
Because it's an open circle. So remember from yesterday we said if it's less than or greater than, it gets an open circle. If it's less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, it would get a closed circle. So this is just less than because we see that this circle is open. So that's our first piece. Now we're going to do the same thing with the second piece. So again, my second piece, I'm going to write it in the form as y equals mx plus b. So I want to find my m and my b. Let's find our slope first. Pick any 2 points on the graph. I could pick this one and this one. And how can I find my slope? Rise over run. So we go up 2 and to the right 1. So this would be 2 over 1, which simplifies to what? 2. So my slope would be 2. So our slope would be 2. Any questions on how we found the slope? How would I find my y-intercept? Just look at the graph. Our b is our y-intercept, where we cross the y-axis. So what's my y-intercept, my b? -1. Awesome. Our graph crosses the y at -1. So when we put this together, I have y equals, m is 2, so 2x, plus b. How would I write that?
Plus 2.
What's b?
2. What? -1.
So -1. a lot of people on the last test would put 2x plus -1. You don't put two signs right next to each other. You get rid of the plus because it's a -1. So it'd be 2x minus 1. So then I would write that as 2x minus 1. And then we also need our restriction part. So restriction part, we're talking about the x values. Is x, what's the point where our graph stops? What x value for our graph here? What's the point where our graph stops?
3.
That's an arrow, so that keeps going forever, but which spot doesn't have an arrow?
-1.
Here, but what's the x value? 0. So are we talking about numbers that are greater than 0 for our x or less than 0? Greater. We're talking about x values that are like 1, 2, 3, 4. So greater than 0. So I would put x is greater than 0. Is it just greater than or equal to? Greater than or equal to, because this was a closed circle here. So because it's a closed circle, it's greater than or equal to. So for B, we're doing the same thing. I'm going to have my y equals with the squiggly line. So with that bracket, we're going to do each piece separate. So I'm going to start with the one on the left. So I need to figure out what my slope is and my y-intercept. What is my slope? How do I find my slope? Rise over run. So we can pick any 2 points. I'm going to the right one and down 1. So what would my slope be? Just 1? -1. Be careful because our line is decreasing. Remember, we talked about this with correlation when we had those points. If I was a person, you walk from left to right, so I'm walking downhill. So my slope has to be negative. So it'd be -1. What is my B? -1. It's where we cross the y-axis, which is at -1. So how would I write that equation of a line?
-x minus 1.
Perfect. Y equals -x minus 1. So I already have that y equals outside my bracket. So inside I just put -x minus 1. Now we also need the restriction part. So because our graph stops, it's just a piece of it. I got to say what values of x we're talking about. So where does our graph stop? At what x value?
-0.
0. It stops at 0. This is where our graph stops. This arrow keeps going forever. This is where our graph stops. So it stops at 0. Are we talking about numbers that are less than 0 or greater than 0? Less than, because we're talking about x values that are -1, -2, -3. So less than. So I would say x is less than 0. Is it just less than or equal to? Less than or equal to, because it's a closed circle. All right, let's look at the next one, the next piece of this. So again, we're going to write our equation as y equals mx plus b. So I need to figure out what my m is and what my b is. So to find the slope, we would do rise over run. So pick 2 points. I go up 1 to the right 1. What would my slope be? Just 1? Yep, because it's positive. It goes in the positive direction. We're increasing here. What is my b? 2. So where we cross the y-axis, so I cross the y-axis here at 2. So to write this piece of the equation, I have y equals what? X plus 2. So I'd put x plus 2. Now we need to write our restriction. So where does my graph stop? 0. So are we talking about values that are greater than 0 or less than 0? Greater. We're talking about x values that are greater than 0. So x is greater than. Is it just greater than or equal to? Just greater than, because it's an open circle. Awesome. Okay, so for C, I'm going to start with my y equals and do my bracket. How many pieces do I have here? 3. So I'm going to have 3 separate equations here. 3 pieces. So we always want to start from the left and work our way to the right. So I'm going to start at the left side. I'm going to start with this piece. My equation, I can make it in slope-intercept form. We could do that because we could see what our slope-intercept is. It doesn't clearly see it, but we could extend our line to see it. So y equals mx plus b. What's my slope?
1.
So pick 2 points. I go to the right one and down one. Just one? It should be -1. So if I extend my line, because do I cross the y-axis here? No. So I don't see what my b is yet, but I could keep going. I could go to the right one, down one, put my point there. To the right one, down one, put my point there. So if I extended my line, what is my b? -2. Perfect. If your graph doesn't cross the y-axis, you can just extend it to see where it would cross the y-axis. Or what else could I do to write an equation? I could write it in the different form, point slope form. So you could use a point in your slope. That works too. But I think slope intercept would always be the easiest. You just have to extend your line to see where your intercept is. So what would this equation of a line be? Y equals what? -x minus 2. Perfect. So my first piece is -x minus 2. Now I need my restriction. Where does my graph stop here? What x value does my graph stop at? -2. Notice how here I have a closed circle at -2. It doesn't keep going at no x values past that. So -2. Are we talking about x values that are greater than -2 or less than -2? Less than. Because our graph goes to the left. So we're talking about values like -3, -4, -5. X values that are less than. So I'd say x is less than -2. Is it just less than or equal to? Less than or equal to. Awesome. Any questions on the first piece? Because we don't have any x values after -2. That's where our graph stops. So that's the x value where our graph stops. It's not always going to be 0. So it's just the x value where we stop. We stop at -2. Yeah. All right, so let's look at our second piece. So my second piece is what type of line?
Straight.
It's a straight line. We call it a constant because it doesn't have any slope. So if I had y equals mx plus b, what do you think my m is? 0. There's no slope. We don't have any rise. We don't have any run. It's just a flat line. What's my b? 2. I cross the y-axis at 2. So if I were to write this as an equation, I have y equals what?
2.
Just 2. Awesome. Because we would say 0x, which 0x is just 0. So just 2. So y equals 2. Now, for this piece, what x values?
-2 and 1.
Perfect. Our graph only goes from -2 to 1, just looking at the x values. So x is going to be in between -2 and 1. Now, what value is this? What x value here? 0. Right? 0 is here. Let's just see what signs we put. So if I have -2 and 0, is -2 less than or greater than 0? Less than. So I'd say less than. And then the other sign's always going to be the same one. Is 0 less than or greater than 1? Less than. So when you have two numbers, you could always just pick an x value in between these two and test it and see if it works. So x is going to be some number in between -2 and 1. Do I have just less than signs or less than or equal to? Just less than. So you always want to check because sometimes we could have an open circle and a closed circle. So then at 1, it would be equal to if it was a closed circle. But because these are both open circles, it's just less than signs. Are we good with that piece? Awesome. So let's work on the third piece now. So if y equals mx plus b. So what is my slope? Up 2 and 1 to the right. So what would m be? 2 over 1, which simplifies to 2. So my slope is 2. Does my line here that's given to me cross the y-axis? No. But can I extend it to make it cross the y-axis? Yeah. So to find my b, I'm just going to extend my line. So instead of going up 2 and to the right 1, I would just go down 2 and to the left 1. Just extend your line. So what would my b be? -3. Perfect. So how would I write this equation?
2x minus 3.
Awesome. 2x minus 3. So y equals 2x minus 3. So now what x value does our graph start at? 1. So are we talking about values, x values that are greater than 1 or less than 1? So x is greater than 1. Is it greater than or greater than or equal to? Greater than or equal to because it's a closed circle there. So you should always be careful with these numbers. We're always talking about x values. So if you want to just like save the restrictions for last, you can cross out the y. That way you're only looking at these numbers. And you need to see that x is less than -2. It's in between -2 and 1, and it's greater than 1. So you're only looking at these numbers here, the x numbers.